Hi everyone. Welcome to Community Cares and Project Echo. On behalf of Screen and J and Rutgers Cancer Institute, we are here to bring you this Project Echo session. And today's session will be on clinical trials and the research process and informed consent. I have a few announcements and then we can begin with the presentation. This is just a quick disclaimer that the information contained in this presentation is not a substitute for any sort of medical consultation, and a physician should always be consulted for any health problem or medical condition. And today's agenda, we're going to do a Project Echo series overview, introductions, the presentation, case study, and then we'll do questions and answers at the end. A little bit about Project Echo. The Rutgers Cancer Institute became a Project Echo hub in 2021. Project Echo is a movement to demonopolize knowledge and amplify local capacity to provide best practice care for underserved people all over the world. The ECHO model is committed to addressing the needs of the most vulnerable populations by equipping communities with the right knowledge at the right place at the right time. And this is done by using technology to leverage scarce resources, sharing best practice to reduce disparities, applying case-based learning to master complexity, and evaluating and monitoring outcomes. For more information on Project ECHO, you can visit their website, which is echo.unm.edu. And then for our speakers today, we have Ryan Moulton, who is a community cancer control specialist / health educator for the community outreach and engagement team at Rutgers Cancer Institute, Cancer Health Equity. He has been working for Rutgers Cancer Institute since April 2022. Ryan's focus areas within the team include prostate cancer, genetics, familial risk, clinical trials, and the research process. Ryan also works very closely with our network of community members, leading and facilitating internal programs to bridge the gap between research and the community. For our case study, we have Laura Sullivan, who is an experienced oncology research nurse and a nurse leader dedicated to advancing cancer care through clinical research and evidence-based practice. With a Doctor of Nursing practice and a board certifications in oncology nursing and nursing leadership, Laura brings a unique blend of clinical expertise, advanced clinical knowledge, research acumen, and team leadership to her role. Without further ado, we have clinical trials and the research process, and I'll pass it to Ryan.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Sarah. Like she mentioned, my name is Ryan Moulton, and today I'm going to give you guys a general overview of clinical trials and the research process. So if we could go to the next slide, we just have a quick disclaimer. Just a reminder to everyone that's here today that the information contained in this presentation is not meant to be a substitute for medical consultation, and a physician should always be consulted for any health problem or medical condition. So before we begin, as always, we have a quick pre-test for you guys to test your existing knowledge, kind of get it to see what you guys already know about clinical trials and the research process. So the poll should be launched for you guys now. 4 simple true or false questions. Take a moment to answer those up on your screen, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll go over the answers again in the post-test. I'll have all the answers to these questions, and then you can use that as a way to evaluate what you learned from today's presentation.
We'll just give it another maybe 30 seconds to give people time to finish up answering.
Sounds good.
You can go on to the next slide.
All right, so this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to first discuss some of the basics of cancer, just give you guys a brief overview, how it develops. And then we're going to define what clinical trials are. We'll review the different kinds of clinical trials and the different phases within a clinical trial. And then we're going to talk a lot about the ethics and the protections that have been put into place for research, and then what someone can also expect while participating in a clinical trial. So Cancer development, when it comes to cancer, cancer can take many, many years to develop, and we consider cancer development as the three phases of carcinogenesis, which is just a fancy way of saying when these normal cells within our body are transformed into cancerous cells. So the first phase in carcinogenesis is initiation, and this occurs when we have those first normal cells within our body that start to mutate. The second phase we define as promotion, and then this is where you have the proliferation of the cancer cells, which means that these mutated cells that have formed within the body are starting to grow and divide, and usually this is at a rapid pace. I do want to mention that during this phase promotion, this is where we like to screen for cancer prevention. This is where you want to do your mammograms for breast cancer detection. You also want to do your pap smears here to detect cervical cancer. And then that's where we're using all these other screening tests to confirm the presence of these abnormal cells within the body. The last phase is progression, and this is the last phase in tumor growth where the tumor becomes more invasive, it becomes more aggressive, and can actually start to spread, which we call metastasize to other parts of the body. And I want to mention here, clinical trials can really be done at any different time points within the three phases of carcinogenesis, and even beforehand, because some trials are for prevention, some are done during treatment. It's really important to kind of nail the hammer on the point that clinical trials can be done at any point in time with really any stage of cancer. So now we're going to go into the different kinds of clinical trials. So the first one is prevention trials. And prevention trials, like the name suggests, are looking for better ways to prevent a particular disease in people who may have never had the disease, or to prevent the disease from returning in people who have had the disease. And this isn't just for cancer. These kinds of trials can include different medicines. It can include vaccines, lifestyle changes. A very timely example of this would actually be the COVID-19 vaccine trials that took place over the last couple of years. When we think about cancer clinical trials specifically, prevention trials would be actually testing new methods to prevent cancer in healthy people or prevent cancer from returning in cancer survivors. Next, we have screening trials, and these are testing for new ways to detect diseases. So when we think about screening trials for cancer, we're testing new ways to detect cancer in people. A good example of a screening trial that was done that's not pertaining to cancer was when Rutgers developed a saliva test for COVID-19. That's a detection method that had to go through a screening trial, make sure it was safe and effective for people to use. And now you see similar tests that are being used by the public every day. They're also commonly used for cancer, of course. These would be new tests for detecting cancer in people before symptoms appear or while symptoms are present. Next, you have diagnostic trials, and these are studying or comparing different tests or procedures for finding a particular disease. And I just want to note that screening and diagnostic trials are kind of two different things. So when we think about screening, screening is routine testing for patients without symptoms, and further testing may be done if a screening finds any possible abnormality, any red flag that may indicate the presence of cancer. So essentially, it is for patients without symptoms, although there may be instances where an individual is displaying minimal symptoms and is undergoing a screening exam because of that. When we think about diagnostic testing, this is actually done to investigate those symptoms or any possible abnormalities that may have been found during a screening exam. So essentially, this is testing for patients that have symptoms or for patients whose screening showed a possible abnormality. So an example of this could be testing a new method for performing a biopsy, which is how many doctors are confirming the presence of cancer by going in and collecting and testing tissue samples from an area of the body where there may be the presence of cancer. Now we have treatment trials, and like the name suggests, these are testing new treatments. And these could be, for example, a new combination of drugs. It could be new approaches to surgery, to radiation therapy, to treat specific types of cancer. So you're just testing the effectiveness and the safety of new treatments. Now you have behavioral trials, and these are looking at behavioral changes that are meant to improve someone's health or mitigate their risk of developing a disease. For example, there are some behavior trials that may look at what we call the effect of standard versus enhanced risk reduction counseling. An example of that would be education, therapy, in order to evaluate risk behavior incidents in individuals. So the behavior could be something like, for example, drug use. And so a study that's a behavioral trial would be investigating whether enhanced risk reduction counseling increased or decreased the incidence of drug use compared to what the standard risk reduction counseling is or what they're currently doing to mitigate someone's risk of using drugs. Now you have quality of life trials. We also call these supportive care trials, and these are investigating and finding new ways to improve the comfort and quality of life of people that have acute or chronic illness. And then lastly, we have compassionate use trials, and these are a way to kind of provide someone who may or may not have any other options an opportunity to try a new treatment or a new drug, even if it may not be fully approved yet. And this was, again, something that we actually saw with COVID-19 treatments in the recent years. All right, so moving on, we're going to look at the different phases of a clinical trial. So we typically break these into 5 phases. You have the preclinical stage. This is considered the development and the animal testing phase of the drug. We have to do this in order to make sure that the treatment can work in people, because in this phase there's really nothing given to any human subjects. We have to make sure that the drug that's being tested or the treatment that's being tested is safe before it's tested on humans. And this phase can take several years to move into phase 1. Once the drug or the treatment's approved for human subjects testing, that's when you complete the preclinical phase. And then you move on into phase 1 trials. And this is when the researchers are testing this drug or this treatment in a small group of people, typically about 20 to 80 participants for the first time. This is mainly so that they can get a better idea about the dosing, which is how much medicine someone can safely take. And they also want to use this phase to identify any side effects that may appear from over or under dosing. And side effects are always intensely monitored throughout all phases to uphold our commitment to safety for all participants. You have phase 2 trials. This is when the new drug, the new treatment is given to a larger group of people. Typically in phase 2 trials, you have about 100 to 300 participants. And again, you're just making sure that it's working like it's supposed to. You're just expanding on the results of phase 1. Phase 3 is when the new drug is given to a larger group of people. So here we typically see about 300 to 3,000 participants. And again, we're just confirming that the drug, the treatment is working like it's supposed to. We're going to continue monitoring those side effects. And this is where researchers will start to compare whatever drug is being studied, whatever treatment's being studied, with similar treatments that are already being used. And they're going to evaluate whether it's better than what the standard treatment is. So if a drug passes phase 3, it's then submitted to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, or some other regulatory agency for approval. And then the FDA is going to review that and what's been tested so far, looking at all the data to confirm safety and effectiveness. And then that's when it moves into phase 4 trials. And these are done only after a drug or treatment is approved by the FDA. And the Food and Drug Administration, they're the branch of the government that is approving drugs. They're making them available to the public. So phase 4 trials are done after introduction to the public. So researchers are going to track the drug's safety in the general public, and they're going to just look out for more information about the drug's benefits, its optimal use. They're going to continue monitoring side effects caused over time in the general public. So phase 4 trials are really done to look for side effects that may not have been seen in earlier trials, and they're also going to look at how well the new treatment's working over a longer period of time. So now we're going to get into the history of clinical trials, because we kind of think of clinical trials as this, modern revelation, this new idea, but they've actually been around for a very long time. We know that the world's first clinical trial is recorded in the book of Daniel in the Bible. And then in 1537, we had a French surgeon named Ambroise Paré. He tested a treatment for battlefield wounded soldiers, creating a digestive made of egg yolk, oil of roses, turpentine. So just those really early instances of studies being done on humans. But moving on, the one we want to highlight is James Lind. He's considered the first doctor to have conducted a controlled clinical trial of the modern era in 1747. So he was working on a ship. He was a ship's doctor. He noticed a lot of his sailors were falling ill to scurvy. If you're not familiar, scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency. It's a disease that comes from a vitamin C deficiency and can kill you if it's not treated, quickly and adequately. So he planned a comparative trial by giving the sailors different treatments and then just comparing what worked with what didn't. So through essentially trial and error, he found that by giving sailors limes, he was able to reduce cases of scurvy on the ship. And so this was kind of a revelation to him because, this was way before we knew that vitamin C could prevent scurvy. So because of this, he was able to help cure some of his sailors, save lives, make sure they're not dying from scurvy. And that's actually where the English sailors get their nickname from. If you guys have ever heard them called limeys, it's because of that control study that Dr. Lind did. And then later on in the 1800s, as research developed, a lot of it was based on forms of that comparative trial that we saw in 1747. So, for instance, we had randomized trials, and they used what we call a chance and pick, people at random. And then they would separate them into two different groups. And this is where we also start to see the use of placebos, which compared a treatment with what we call a sugar pill or a placebo, and measuring basically the psychological effects versus an actual physical effect. I do want to note in cancer clinical trials, there's never, a placebo that's used. You wouldn't get a placebo, a sugar pill. You'd either receive the usual standard treatment or a new treatment that's being studied. And now I want to talk about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, because this is a really, you know, great example of unethical research that occurred before we had regulations that were put into place. So, if you're not familiar with Henrietta Lacks, she was an African American woman that lived near Baltimore in the 1900s. She had a very aggressive type of cervical cancer. So she ended up going to Johns Hopkins University Hospital in 1951 to get treated for that. What happened was the doctors there removed the tumor, and then without her permission, they took those malignant cells from her cervix and they started to experiment on them. The problem with that is that she did not give her consent, nor did her family for her cells to be used in any type of experiment and any type of study that was being done. Unfortunately, she ended up dying shortly after her treatment, and her family was never compensated at the time for the use of Henrietta's cells. So this is pretty significant because her cells ended up becoming extremely important in medical research. They're actually still used to this day. We call them the Gila immortal cell line. They're the oldest and the most used cell lines we have in research. And these cell lines essentially enabled the development of, things like the polio vaccine, even the COVID-19 vaccines. So at Johns Hopkins, there was a committee that ended up getting tasked with deciding who can use the HeLa cells. And this committee now includes two members of the Lacks family to make sure that they're using them for good purpose. And while Johns Hopkins kind of claims and says that they never profited from these cells, we do know that in 2021, the Lacks family ended up suing biotech company Thermo Fisher for using and profiting off of the HeLa cells. So this company Thermo Fisher, they claims to generate an annual revenue of up to 35 billion, and more than 100 corporations have profited from the use of HeLa cells. So they tried to get the lawsuit dismissed by claiming statute of limitations have expired at the time of collection, consent laws were not in place. But as of 2023, the Lacks family did end up settling with them for an undisclosed amount. And unfortunately, this isn't a unique situation of people being abused in research. We also had the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This began in the 30s. It ran on till about the 70s, and which is really not that long ago when you think about it. And in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, if you guys aren't familiar, this is where you had African American men who were infected with syphilis. The researchers knew they had syphilis, and they intentionally withheld life-saving treatment from these individuals. Um, Penicillin, if you're familiar, this is the treatment for syphilis, and that ended up becoming the choice treatment for syphilis in 1943. It was becoming widely available at the time, and the researchers, again, knew this and withheld that treatment from their participants. And so the effects of this study are still felt to this day. It can be seen in how African Americans deal with the medical community and clinical research, and vice versa. You'll see in the next couple of slides of looking at the regulations that were put into place as a direct result of this study. Now I want to talk a little bit about these ethical milestones. As we move throughout history, as you guys just saw, or as we just discussed with Henrietta and Tuskegee, there were definitely problems with the way people were being treated in medical studies. And, this is where we have to start looking at what regulations were put into place to prevent these atrocities from occurring again in the future. So that's when we go into the Nuremberg Code in 1947. This gave us voluntary informed consent, and we're going to talk a lot about that with Laura in the next few minutes. This code, which essentially describes the 10 standards that researchers must conform to when they're carrying out experiments on human subjects. Nuremberg Code, this was developed as a result of the atrocities that were committed by the Nazi experiments during World War II. And so, as you can see on the timeline, in the case of Henrietta Lacks, consents were in place when her HeLa cells were used for research without her consent, which of course violated the principles of the Nuremberg Code. And then in 1962, you had the Kefauver-Harris Amendment. This was introduced and passed in response to an instance, this was mostly in Europe, where they had thousands of infants who were born with severe congenital abnormalities because their mothers took this new medication called thalidomide for treating nausea and morning sickness while they're pregnant. And we also saw thousands of miscarriages happen during this time too. So this amendment was meant to strengthen drug regulation in the United States. And they did this by requiring manufacturers of drugs to prove the safety and effectiveness of drug products with substantial evidence through clinical studies before they're actually allowed on the market. Then in 1974, we have the U.S. National Research Act that was passed and introduced in response to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where again, we had for 40 years African-American men deliberately not told they had syphilis and were never treated for it, even when we had an effective treatment that was made available. In 1979, we also got the Belmont Report. This gave us institutional review boards, which we're also going to cover later in the presentation. And it also established the 3 principles for human subject research, which is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice or equity in research. And then moving on in 1996, we also have the International Conference on Harmonization. This just made all these protections that were created in all these guidelines that were established. It just made that international. So it also developed what we call the good clinical practice. This is, again, an international set of guidelines that helps make sure the results of a clinical trial are reliable. It also helps to make sure that patients that are participating in a clinical trial are protected. So all of these regulations that were put into place were done so to protect people when they participate in clinical studies, and all of these guidelines continue to be updated as needed. So as I mentioned, part of the regulations that were put into place specifically for the Belmont Report in 1979 were institutional review boards. So we call these IRBs, and IRBs is a group of people that's a combination of community members, researchers that are not part of a study. So every study has an IRB, and they make sure that someone who's in the IRB has no affiliation with the study that they're on the board for. And so they review and look at the clinical trial protocol to make sure that all the participants are protected. They're informed about what's going to happen to them should they participate in the clinical trial. And if you are in a clinical trial for any reason, if you feel concerned, if you feel that something isn't going the way it's supposed to, you're nervous about something, the IRB is who you would go to talk about and bring up these concerns. In addition to the IRB, we also have some other government organizations that help protect people in clinical trials. So this would include the DSMB. We call this the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. They make sure that the clinical trials are safe for people to participate in. They're involved typically in phase 3 of the trials, and they're also part of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which provides funding for a lot of these clinical trials. And again, they're making sure that all of these trials are led by researchers that are trained in the good clinical practice guidelines. So those were the guidelines that we saw implemented in 1996. And then you have the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. We talked a little bit about this during the phases slide. They're just overseeing and regulating the conduct of clinical trials. And if you recall in the previous couple slides, they're actually the ones that mandated the IRB. And they're also in charge of the Office of Good Clinical Practice. So they oversee those guidelines that were implemented. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about consent, which Lauren's going to expand upon a lot further later in the case study. But the consent form is required before any clinical trial, and it's essentially just outlining and telling you what to expect, the purpose of the trial, all the risks and benefits of participating in the clinical trial. And it's also going to outline the importance of your privacy, keeping your health information confidential, because that's a big concern for people. It also talks about if there's any cost associated to you, if there's any payment that the individual will need if they participate in a clinical trial. In many cases, most of the costs are actually covered by the drug makers or by insurance. But basically, the informed consent is just supposed to give you a clear understanding of any associated costs, again, any of the risks and benefits of participating, the purpose, because you only sign the consent form when you have all of your questions answered, you're well informed, you know what's going to happen during the trial, and of course you're comfortable participating in the clinical trial. And we always like to remind people that participating in a clinical trial is 100% voluntary. The consent process is ongoing, meaning that you can withdraw or leave the trial at any time for any reason. So you can withdraw your consent for participating in the clinical trial. Now looking at the protocol. So the protocol is part of every study, and I like to think of it as like a recipe. So the protocol gives prospective participants all of the information that they need before they can start the clinical trial. So it includes an overview of the study, how the study is actually designed. They're going to look at how long the clinical trial is going to last, how many people are participating, and they're even going to outline the reasons as to why someone may or may not be eligible for a clinical trial. So talking about that eligibility criteria. It's like this recipe for the researchers that they need to follow to ensure quality of a quality study. So what are the steps that researchers take in a clinical trial? So the process moves along, step by step, and essentially is going to just start with an idea. What do I want to conduct a study on? Where do I see a gap? Where do I see improvement in treatment for a specific type of cancer? So once that idea comes to light, the following steps would include experiment design and protocol. This is where you get that recipe, the protocol that we just talked about. This is where that comes into play. And then the IRB that we mentioned earlier, this is who's going to review and approve the protocol and the informed consent, make sure that all participants, all prospective participants for this trial are going to be protected and safe. Once these protections are in place, the participants are recruited and enrolled in the study, and that's when the study begins. Once they move through everything, they complete the study, move through all the phases, then they analyze the data, and then finally the results are going to be shared with the participants and then also published in most cases in a research journal. So participants will know what happens with the data and how the study finishes once they finish up their participation. All right, so just like the researchers have, this step-by-step approach in a way, so do the participants of a trial. So here's what people can expect in that clinical trial process. An individual will work with their healthcare provider, with their physician. They'll talk about the steps of participating in a clinical trial, and we're going to look at each step one by one here. First, we have shared decision making. So shared decision making is really once that diagnosis has been made. So, the individual works with your medical team, just determining whether or not you would like to participate in, or if you're even eligible for a clinical trial. So once, let's say, for example, your oncologist mentions that, hey, you are eligible for a specific clinical trial, looking at a new treatment for the specific type of cancer that you have, this is when you would start that shared decision-making process. So it's going to focus on the participant and really help improve the communication between the participant and the healthcare team. It leads to, we know, better satisfaction because it actually helps people understand the information in a way that would benefit them. So it's really having that two-way conversation about whether participating in the clinical trial is right for you. So these decisions are going to always be made with the prospective participants' values in mind and honoring their best interests. If you do decide to participate in a clinical trial, this is where you'd have the informed consent process. So you're going to be told about the risks, the benefits, any costs associated with participation. This is where you'd review the protocol. Like I mentioned before, once you fully understand the process and only when you agree to it, this is when you sign the informed consent form to actually enroll in the clinical trial. And again, trial participation is always going to be 100% voluntary. Consent will always be an ongoing process. You can withdraw or leave a clinical trial at any time for any reason. Next step is going to be the actual clinical trial. So you're going to be enrolled and participate in the clinical trial. And during the trial, you're still going to be monitored by your medical team. You'll still be working closely with your medical team. Depending on the outcomes, you may continue the treatment. Many times, participants actually feel like they're getting better care because they're so closely monitored and followed by the research team and also by their medical team during the clinical trial. So you'll be participating in that for as long as they need you. And then finally, moving on to the post-trial, once your clinical trial is complete, you and your doctor are just going to talk about the next steps. You may consider participating in other trials. You'll be informed when the data is published and the research is published, and you may consider doing something else in the future. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of regulations were put into place due to atrocities, to protect people because of all these past abuses. So historically, we really never had that shared decision-making process as part of the research process because vulnerable populations were being abused. So all this abuse that happened in these vulnerable populations has led to a lot of mistrust, where we do unfortunately still see the effects to this day. We've seen it more recently with the COVID-19 vaccine, and these are, of course, legitimate concerns. In addition to participation mistrust, we also see barriers for researchers when researchers are hesitant to include trial participants because of fears of harming people. This is really kind of a specific case in pregnant women, that's what comes to mind because, researchers don't want to harm who we'd consider to be vulnerable in research. So because of this mistrust, and also because of some researcher hesitancy, we see that certain groups of people do not participate in clinical trials as frequently as others. And this can have an effect on the results of the trial because we really don't know how the missing groups or the missing populations will respond to the drug we're testing or the new treatment we're testing. And this ends up leading to poor treatment outcomes for these specific groups. So we generally see this in race, gender, and age. But historically, these populations were not used in trials as often, and especially in the era where we actually have regulations. So moving on, another reason why we need diversity in clinical trials is because we just don't have a good representation of tissue samples. The majority of samples are from white people of European descent. So without diverse tissue samples, we do have a harder time creating effective treatments for everyone, for all races, for all ages, and all genders. You may be asking yourself, what's in it for me? Why should I even participate in a clinical trial? Why should someone I care deeply about, you know, put themselves in a clinical trial? We know that we know and acknowledge that participating in a clinical trial can be and is a very hard decision to make, especially if you aren't sure how it can benefit you. And that's why we really kind of nail down that shared decision making process and the informed consent process. But just remember, all studies for an individual are only considered when the benefits outweigh the risks. So I just want to talk a little bit about the pros and the cons of participating in a clinical trial. Some of the pros are, having that early access to new life-saving or life-extending treatment. The new treatment that's being tested actually may end up being superior to what they're using currently. They also, like I mentioned before, people in clinical trials, they also feel like they're getting a better care due to being closely monitored and followed throughout the trial. For people who are uninsured or underinsured, many drug makers are actually going to cover the costs of the drugs that are being tested, increasing access to new treatments for these individuals. For people that are considered terminally ill, their lives may end up being extended long enough to get some of their affairs in order. If it's a hereditary illness, you may be helping others in your own family by participating in that clinical trial. And then some studies may actually provide or pay participants as an incentive. For example, have you ever received a gift card for filling out a survey, doing Zoom interviews, things like that? Oftentimes people are incentivized to participate in those smaller studies. Of course, there are some cons associated with clinical trials. The treatment may not work as expected. There's also the risk of side effects for the new drug or the new treatment. You may need more time for treatments to be effective compared to the standard. And then you also have more doctor visits, of course. If you have to travel for the study, you may need to book hotels for overnight stays. So that can be a burden on people, especially people who have families, who have children at home. We do know that some behavioral health studies may provide childcare. It's generally an exception and not the rule. So that comes into play as well, covering the cost of childcare if you do participate. But all in all, clinical trials are very important for the development of new medicines, new treatments, and they really help, keep our generations healthy. While there are barriers, like we've acknowledged, researchers today are really trying hard to include as many people as possible in these clinical trials so that treatment options are available to everyone and they can help improve, all communities and all future generations. Just quickly, I know I'm at about 44 minutes past 10. Just quickly talking about the futures, the future of clinical trials can include or may include studies of genes of our immune system. So looking at those types of studies, they can result in medicines and therapies that are actually very personalized to you as an individual. And this is really important because now that we know that there are differences among the races, especially with inflammatory response due to different genetic factors, we can actually kind of customize treatments for individuals. And then moving on, technology is also seen as a useful tool to collect data to help keep people safe during clinical trials, both now and also in the future as we continue to evolve, in technology. It's a way for people to, communicate much more easily with their healthcare team, with their healthcare providers, and may make it easier to actually participate in a clinical trial or enroll in a clinical trial. And that's really the goal when you think about it, is making it easier, essentially incentivizing people because of the easiness to participate in a clinical trial, making them more accessible, making sure we really let people know why clinical trial participation is important. We want to help these researchers find, the best ways for people to stay healthy, to create better tests and treatments, just to help people now, but also in the future. Just to summarize, that really our goal is to make it easier to participate in clinical trials, alleviate those stresses and misconceptions about clinical trials, and really let people know why clinical trial participation is so important. Looking back, we talked about the different kinds of clinical trials, how all of these different trials, regardless of the type of trial, they all must follow the protocols set into place, the guidelines that have been put into place to protect people, to keep people safe during clinical trial participation. And by participating in a clinical trial, you or a family member are helping researchers find the best, the most effective ways for people to stay healthy, to create better tests and treatments that can help you and your loved ones now and in the future.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was a great presentation. And now I'll pass it to Laura to talk about informed consent.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ryan. That was a very, very thorough, in-depth review of clinical trials. I'm going to focus more on the informed consent process. Um, just to give a little bit background of myself, I have been in clinical research for the past 8 years, specifically in oncology. I started as a clinical trial specialist where I was kind of the first person to introduce clinical trials to patients. And then I moved into a research nurse role where I was the one actually kind of, working with the patients directly receiving the interventions. And now I'm in a management position where I oversee breast, GYN, lung, and head and neck disease study groups here at the Rutgers Cancer Institute. So, the purpose of informed consent is there's many, many reasons that we do informed consent. First and foremost, provides the education to the patients that will allow them to make the most appropriate decision based on their treatment. Nowadays, patients are coming in very informed due to access to the internet and research that is available to them. So they have they're more involved in the decision-making process than they were before. The informed consent process itself serves as a communication between whether it's the provider or the research nurse, or any nurse actually, to go over the details of the study. It allows for the patient to make the decision. It reiterates over and over and over again throughout the entire document that this is voluntary. And it kind of goes over that they can leave at any time, which Ryan has already really honed in on. It also reduces legal liability for the provider because it goes over the risks and benefits. It goes over, if there's injury language, what patients are to do during those situations. It also, if patients have any questions about the study itself, it directs them to the IRB, which is something that Ryan had also mentioned as well. Each informed consent document contains what we call the elements of informed consent. So there are some studies that have informed consents that are 50 plus pages long. There are others that are maybe 13 pages. It really depends on the type of study, the drugs that are involved, who wrote the protocol, and who wrote the informed consent. So a lot of times we have industry-sponsored studies, which are your pharmaceutical companies, and they will provide their own legal language for their protection. In addition to that, our site here has their legal language. So the same thing is said 40 different ways put into one document, and now it has this it's 50 plus pages. But regardless of the length of the consent, each consent you picked up is going to have the same type of information throughout. So first, it's going to be the purpose of the study, whether it's to test the safety, whether it's to see how effective it is, or whether it's to compare it to the standard of care that's already on the market. That is all detailed in typically the first or second paragraph of that document. In addition, it goes over how long the patient's expected to be involved in the study. So whether it's 2 years, whether it's until they withdraw consent, death, they progress with their disease. It really is specific to each study, but it's also outlined so patients are aware of what the commitment actually is. It goes over the procedures that are expected, so physical exams, vital signs, labs, things like that are outlined. It also goes over any procedures that are considered experimental. So if there is research lab draws that are performed, these are blood draws strictly for research purposes, it's outlined in the document. So patients understand that they are going to give a couple, additional blood samples while they're here. For whatever reason, they describe it as teaspoons. I can't think of a time when I ever measured a blood draw via teaspoons, but that's how they decide to describe it, because the consent forms are written at typically a fifth grade reading level. So I think they just decided teaspoons was easier for patients than milliliters, potentially. It goes over any foreseeable risks and discomforts, as well as any benefits. It also outlines, potential alternatives if the patient decides not to participate in the study. And I'll show you some examples of language that goes over the alternatives in a later slide. There's always a confidentiality statement, whether that's included in the document itself or its own separate document, but this goes over the HIPAA guidelines and how we have to, protect everyone's identity and any health related information. It goes over compensation. This is a lot of times now patients are actually being reimbursed for their time, which I think is fantastic. So it outlines if there's anything specific to compensation for their participation. It also goes over injury language. So if patients were to experience an adverse event, what they should do, what they'll be responsible for, what our site or the sponsor of the study will be responsible for. Sometimes if there is an adverse event related to the study itself, it outlines that the sponsor will pay for any hospitalization that may occur during their timeline on the study. There's also study contact information, and this is whether it's the research team, the IRB, if there's anything that they need to address related to the study, there's a phone number there to get in touch with somebody. And of course, as we've said 30 different ways, the voluntary statement. Participation is voluntary. I tell patients they can sign the consent, they can walk out the door, they can change their mind, and nothing happens. It's okay. We'll just refer them back to the standard of care, and that's the end of it. So really the patient is in the driver's seat, and the research team is just here to really steer the wheel for them, and the patient's in charge of the gas and brake pedals. Anytime the consent process, takes place, there is required documentation, and this was put out, I believe it was by JCO. And basically, whether it's the research nurse, kind of fills in some of this information, or the provider really is the one to document these things. So they go over the trial with the patient, and then they're required to document the purpose of the intervention, any of the risks or benefits associated with the intervention, any of alternatives that are available to the patient, and then also the risks and benefits of the alternatives. And this last part is the assessment of patient understanding. I recently finished my DNP program last summer, and my project was actually related to patient understanding of the informed consent. There's obviously a health literacy issue, and there's no standardization currently for patients to prove that patients actually understand the information that's being presented to them. So the study that I did was using teach back throughout the informed consent process. So I will say that the assessment of patients' understanding is required documentation, but at this time, there's really no standardization to prove that the patient knows what you're talking about or doesn't know what you're talking about. My personal approach, anytime I go and I meet a patient for the first time, typically I am the second conversation that they're having. I always start off with, can you tell me what you remember from your conversation with the doctor? So this way I can kind of gauge, oh, okay, you understand. Some people will tell you the exact dose and how many days they're going to get it and every possible side effect under the sun. And others will just say, well, this is for my cancer. I'm not really sure. So it really helps gauge where the conversation needs to go and the aspects that really need to be focused on when you're meeting with these patients to ensure that they do actually understand. Because, like I said, there's really no way to standardize this at this time. There is a process for obtaining informed consent. In a perfect world, the provider would have the initial discussion. The research nurse will come down with the document. The patient will, ideally go home, have time to talk about it, think about it, and then come back and sign the consent. There are situations where that's just not feasible, and patients, are signing the same day and then maybe making their decision afterwards. Regardless of how it transpires, there's an oral presentation of the consent document. So the research nurse will sit down with the patient and go over the document essentially page by page and just make sure that the patient understands each component of the elements of consent and make sure that they agree and that they are, agree or willing to participate in the study. If they are willing to participate, then the signatures are obtained. We do a wet signature. At this time, we aren't really doing any electronic informed consents. That might come down the line later, I hope. It would just be a nice thing for patients. But then the patients are given a copy of the informed consent, and then the research nurse goes back and documents the process. There are some special considerations when it comes to informed consent. Not every situation is cut and dry. First, the one that I think we encounter the most are non-English speaking patients. If there is a non-English speaking patient to be consented, we have to obtain a short form. And this is basically a very, very short description of the study. They essentially take, let's say it's a 50-page consent. They take that 50 pages, they kind of condense it into maybe 2 or 3 pages in a language that the patient understands. And then we utilize a translation service that has to be, here we use the Marty iPad service. If it could not be a family member, it could not be someone who a friend that speaks the language or an employee that speaks the language. It has to be through this third-party translation service. So you essentially, you know, read the consent to the or to the translator. The translator then translate the information to the patient. And then the patient, is of course given the opportunity to agree, move on to the next section. It gives them the opportunity to ask questions with anything that needs to be clarified. Children are also another special consideration. This is not my area of expertise, but we do have a PEDS team here that interacts with children. So children between the ages of 7 and 12 can give assent, meaning that they kind of understand what's going on and they can agree to participate. And then they sign a separate form saying that they agree. Children that are over 12 but less than 18, they have their own line on the consent form that they would sign underneath the parents. And if the study presents minimal than greater risk to patients, then both parents must sign the consent unless there's some very special circumstance. And then another area that I, again, have not seen often is utilizing a legally authorized representative. So this is for when a patient lacks the capacity to actually give consent. This is a very lengthy process because a provider who's not affiliated with the research team, has to make this decision that the patient cannot give consent. And then somebody who knows the patient in some capacity is the one that's ultimately going to be signing on the patient's behalf. And then this slide here are just some snippets of different consent forms that I pulled, like the main elements from. So the first one is a description of why the research is being done. It's very clear. They're testing this drug, PCS6422, using with capecitabine to see how the drugs work together for breast cancer. This, if they'll be paid to participate, this particular study did not offer any compensation. And of course, the voluntary statement, so you can see it in its light of what we've said a bunch of times. So it's that your participation is voluntary. You can discontinue at any time. The bullets here are also if you choose, these are if you choose not to partake in the study, these are some of the options available. Some studies will also outline the standard of care option. Not every study does that because this might not be comparable to standard of care. And then there's always a little paragraph related to the benefit of the study. And it's very blunt, which is, I guess, nice, but I think it's a little too blunt at times because it just very clearly says you may not benefit from this study. We don't know if this will work. That's what we're trying to figure out. So I will say the informed consent process as a whole is an excellent opportunity for the nurse and the patient to really make that connection. It really opens up the lines of communication and it provides patients with the ability to make decisions in their healthcare, which is ultimately what we want at the end of the day. And these are my references here.
Thank you so much, Laura. I also have some resources that Ryan has linked for clinical trials. If anyone has any questions that they want to ask, feel free to ask now. But this will be posted to our Mighty Network, so you could always ask Laura or Ryan a question there. I can't see the chat, so
We don't have any questions.
okay.
A quiet
And
group today. If anybody wants
sometimes,
to unmute and ask a question, you can.
yes, please feel free. Also, if you come up with a question later, like I said, sometimes I even ask in the Mighty Networks.
We're going to do the post test, and we appreciate you guys hanging on for a couple minutes longer than expected. The poll should be launched for you guys once we get all the answers in. I'm going to go over the answers for you real quick. So if in the meantime, while we're discussing the post test, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat for Laura and I.
I do have an observation. I mentioned it in the chat, and you kind of alluded to it as well, Ryan. A lot of these things weren't, Tuskegee wasn't that long ago, and for some of us of a certain age, it actually was still happening during our lifetimes. So, it's just if historically this is all fairly recent. So I
Hmm.
just wanted to make that observation. Like it really is fairly recent that these protections have been put in place.
Oh yeah, and it's a shame it had to take so long and we had to have these atrocities occur before someone said to themselves, why don't we have any protections for these individuals? And it does put it into perspective when you think about how a lot of us have family members that are alive that kind of witnessed this or lived through this.
And I know I also encounter, even still, I mean, clinical trials are really gaining more publicity and people seem to be a little bit more open-minded, but I still encounter a lot of patients that have that whole guinea pig mindset, like, oh, I'm just a guinea pig. And, oh, wait, well, a guinea pig can't say no, whereas a person can. So that's kind of the counter to that. But there's a lot of people I encounter that still have that idea.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll if you want to review the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. So looks like a lot of you did good. For question one, there's only one type of clinical trial. Of course, the answer is false. So there's far more than one type of clinical trial. We actually covered many different types of trials: prevention, screening, diagnostic, treatment, behavioral. For the second question, the answer is true. So all clinical trials follow a recipe or what we call a strict series of steps outlined in the protocol. For question three, the answer is false. So remember, informed consent is an ongoing process, so participants can withdraw or leave the trial at any time for any reason. And for the last question, the answer is true. So our institutional review boards, IRBs, for each trial, they review the clinical trial protocol and make sure that all participants are informed and protected. And that is also the group you would go to bring up any concerns about your participation. So here we have our NJC slide. So NJC is the New Jersey Cancer Education Early Detection Program, and they provide free screenings for people who are low income, uninsured, underinsured. They will work with a patient and provide them with a screening for breast cancer, cervical, colorectal, or prostate cancer. And our navigation team works very closely with the NJC facilities throughout all 21 counties in New Jersey to connect individuals to the screenings that they need.
The QR code should be in the chat, so please let us know how we did. The Mighty Networks link is also in the chat, so go check it out. We post everything from the session on there, including the resources. And then next month, we're going to be talking about infectious diseases, so make sure you register for that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, guys.